Hi, beautiful women. Today, I want to talk to you about raising your standards. So, first, let's just start out with the fact that men tend to be wired towards efficiency. This is something that was beautifully explained by Alison Armstrong. I'm always such a fan of her work, for lack of a better way of putting it. So, I recommend literally like anything that she puts out. But this was something that she mentioned in one of her God, I've, like, consumed so much of her content, so it's somewhere in there. I don't even remember which part I learned it from. Anyway, I digress. Men tend to be wired for efficiency. This is a beautiful thing, okay? I really wanna start off with saying that this it's a wonderful strength that men have. And I find, like, for example, it's particularly useful for things like building infrastructure, like machines and all of that sort of stuff. Efficiency is amazing. We need it. It's super helpful. It is an absolute strength. It is something to be appreciated. Now, when it comes to relationship, what it means is that their wiring for efficiency means that they're always going to be kind of testing the limits for how little energy they can expend in order to get the result that they want. So, for example, when you first start dating, they're going to like put in a ton of effort and energy into courting you, and then they'll start to pull back the more that they think that they've got you. And this is where you have to push back and be like, no, I'm still holding the standard, or I'm still, I still want your effort to be up here. But the problem is that often, like, we get involved and attached so quickly that then we abandon ourselves and we lower our standards in order to try to keep the guy around, which usually doesn't work anyway. Or we end up quite bitter and resentful because we're not really getting our standards, needs, or desires met. And that it's like a downward spiral. So I don't want to necessarily make men wrong for that. I think that like a lot of this, so much toxic information out there that makes men and women wrong for the way that we're biologically designed. I think there's like so much conversation about how we're socialized and not enough conversation about our biological wirings, which are totally valid. We are not just floating heads. We are mind, body, which is mammals, and spirit. And so I think that we should be considering all of those elements and not just thinking we're a bunch of floating heads that are 100% socially and culturally influenced. So I think that, to me, it's like, yes, this is a strength of men that I can appreciate and honor in the same ways that I appreciate the way that women are wired and how we are different and the beauty that we bring. Yes, I'm generalizing. I do that a lot. So I think if we can kind of like shelve the judgment, I think we can get much farther with all of this and understanding this while still like really holding our own self-worth quite high. And so it's not by saying, men, you're wrong for being this way. It's saying, I understand you're wired this way, and still I am going to put my needs first. And if you're wired to find the most efficient way, well, the efficient way is like all the way up here and it's going to stay up here. And I know that you're wired to test my boundaries, and so I am prepared to hold my boundaries. So that being said, I think you first need to eyeball a guy to see what his standards and values are. If his values are down here to begin with and yours are up here, he's only going to bring you lower and lower and lower and lower to lower, maybe even down here. And because he's going to be going for the most efficient, the least energy possible. And if you want to have a beautiful home, if you want to go on vacations, or like whatever the case, maybe you have some like other examples that are more personal to you. Maybe those seem superficial, whatever. But the point is, if the guy that you're dating would be perfectly fine with living in a shack and you're not, I think that for me, like that is a red flag to consider. That, because men are also very good at being direct and asking for what they want, and women tend to be a lot more relationally oriented, much more oriented towards sacrifice, much more oriented towards people pleasing, and therefore we lower ourselves. We just do. And it's like they test our boundaries and it's exhausting. And so, yes, a man will likely test your boundaries, but a man whose standards are much lower than yours, like he's going to test you and he's going to bring you down much lower than if somebody is kind of on par with you, or even if he has a bit higher standards than you. So I hope that it makes sense. If you have somebody who's down here, they're going to test you and test you and test you until you're down here. And I think that that is a way to lose yourself. That is a recipe for resentment. That is a way of abandoning yourself and what you need and the desired life that you want to have. So it's not that they're wrong. It's about finding someone who is more compatible with you, who shares similar values to you, who wants to have a similar lifestyle as you. And this is on you to pick the right partner. I think so much goes wrong because we have really pedestaled romantic love, and in so many ways it's so impractical. And when that shiny feeling wears off, what you're left with is all the practical stuff that you probably ignored along the way while you were just love goggled up. So I think it's so important for us to have a really high standards from the very beginning, and before we get emotionally attached, really be looking at them and going okay, actually, do we have the same values? Are we compatible? What kind of standards do you have? And just really evaluating the stuff that actually matters, because all that other shiny stuff wears off and it gets old. So, the other thing is if you want to have children, children are also me focused, and they should be. That's just, they are the most vulnerable, and they will fight to get their way. They will, and this consumes so much energy. It's also so worth it, and it's completely valid for children to behave this way. If you are with a man who is, I don't even want to say narcissistic because I feel like that word is used too much. But if you're with a man who has lower standards than you, if you are with a man who's not devoted to you, if you're with a man who is more self-centered, if you're with a man who's not in a provider protector mindset, who's really more so focused on his own ego and being free and doing whatever he wants, and thinking about you second or last, that type of person who's in the me mindset is going to also keep pushing your boundaries and keep basically running you down. And if you are sandwiched between children who are testing you and draining your energy, which is totally fine, as I said, but then also your spouse who also is pushing your boundaries, this is going to degrade you until you just feel like you've disappeared and you've lost yourself and you're just in service and you only exist to be in service to others. And I say this as somebody who has experienced this, thankfully not simultaneously. There's just so much of this conversation around making men bad. And I think what we're really missing that is more empowering is this piece around our selection of somebody who's really good. And I think we have had a lot of messaging around finding a guy who's really attractive or who seems really confident, who gets a lot of women, all these playboys or these, maybe some very sexy musician or whatever. And often those guys tend to not be very devoted, and they tend to be more of the playboy type. We also tend to go for men who are more docile because they seem more safe, especially if we've been burned by the guys who are the playboys. Then we kind of go to the opposite end of the spectrum and pursue these betas who feel really safe, who we can control. But, I think at the end of the day, most of us don't want a man who's a pushover, and we don't want a man who can't provide or protect us and our kids. We want a man who's strong, who, we're turned on by his strength, but also not afraid of it. And so it's finding that right balance. I think we want a man who is devoted. And I think that, being devoted is not the same as being a pushover, because a man who's a pushover is just people pleasing you, and you can't rely on his strength. If things hit the fan and, there's a fight that breaks out, there's an argument that breaks out, there's a situation in which you need him to defend you, he's going to hide behind you. I think for a lot of us, we can mistake a man who people pleases and who is a pushover, who will do whatever we say. We can criticize him and he'll bend to our will. Like I think that becomes pretty unattractive over time. So I say this, this is we're kind of like all over the map here a little bit, but it's about getting clarity on what your standards are. And so, to me, the standard is not about finding somebody who's docile, but understanding how they are wired differently from us and using that information to pick a man based on the right criteria. Because it's all like well and good to have standards of a sort of generic variety. A guy who makes this much money, or a guy who's this tall, or a guy who's this fit, or a guy who has this kind of status. And like, there's nothing wrong with any of those things. I mean, sidebar, I feel like feminism has really taught us to like that there's something super shameful about finding a man who can provide for you, and that means you're a gold digger if you even like were to consider wanting that. I think that's done a major disservice to women. Because at the end of the day, a guy with a nice face who, leaves you in poverty and your children are going without, like that gets old. Like it doesn't matter how nice his mug is, like who cares if he's got a six pack if you are living in a shack. So I think there's something very practical about having that as something that's important to you. And there's nothing shameful about that. It's just practical, especially when children are in the picture. But even if they're not, like what if you get sick and then you're the breadwinner and you're with some lazy guy who doesn't want to work? Like that is a very vulnerable and unpractical situation to put yourself in. So I think you're totally within your rights to be wanting a man who has a good job or owns a business and is successful and is crushing it, especially when he has his energy and power to do so. If you find a guy who's lazy and he's young, it's not going to get any better. It's not. If they're at peak testosterone and peak life force and they are lazy and sitting on the couch, I don't think it's going to get any better. So I think you've got to get really clear on what your standards are and don't shy away from the ones that are practical, because at the end of the day, a pretty face is not going to put food on the table. And it's, a guy who's really soft and is going to do whatever you tell him to do is not going to help you if somebody's attacking you in an alley. I mean, maybe that sounds so far-fetched and like it's not going to happen, but at the same time, I do think that the world, while there's lots of improvements in many ways, and I'm not a doomsdayer by any means, but there is a lot that's unpredictable about the world, and there always has been. And so even though like my alleyway reference is probably terrible, there are lots of things that can happen, and like violent things can happen. Your house can get broken into. Like there's lots of situations where you might want a man who does have the backbone to stand up for you. And also, conversely, if you do have somebody shouting at you or degrading you or being unkind to you, and your man just stands there and you have to stand up for yourself and allow, they're just allowing somebody to bully you, that's very difficult to stay attracted to somebody like that and to continue to respect somebody like that. That might not be true for you, but I think it's true for a lot of us women, that's a difficult thing to be able to reconcile. And like that's not going to be a one-off. You'll experience that again and again and again. And if we want to have longevity in our marriages, I think we need to get it right off the hop. Like I think we need to have our standards up here. And not all men and not all women are suited for partnership. I love men. I think that there's a lot of great men out there. And I think some of those men, even though they might be really talented, they might be really interesting, etc., they are not really great in relationship. They're not really great at taking care of women and children, and it's fine if we don't pick them. Just like there's, I'm sure, lots of women who are not great at being kind and being a good partner to men, and it's fine if they don't pick those women either, right? So I think that there's just like, we're really in a time now because we don't necessarily need each other, where those people are going to be kind of like left out of this whole equation, and unless they mend their ways, so to speak. And I think that's fine. There's so many women talking about how we're like filtering out men who are bad. Men are filtering out women who are bad too. We're not all angels out here, and I think that's okay. That's fine. So I think we have an opportunity to be so discerning. And so I say, raise your standards, just be clear on what they really are, and make sure that they are practical ones and ones that actually really matter. And then you'll pick a spouse who you actually could spend a lifetime with.